Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. We are very excited to be present today, and we are lucky to have Professor Utsa Patnaik with us, who will be speaking today on classical political economy, imperialism, and poverty description. This is a part of our larger webinar series, Dissecting Capitalism, and we are extremely lucky that very senior scholars has chose to share their valuable time with us. We are lucky. Professor Patnaik has taught at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi from 1973 until her retirement in 2010. She has written extensively. It's a long list of publications, and she has been very influential as an economist and as well as a public intellectual. I will only mention her last two work with Prabhat Patnaik, that they are A Theory of Imperialism, published in 2016, and the second one is Capital and Imperialism, published in 2021. So with this, Professor Patnaik, thank you very much again. The floor is yours.
Thank you for asking me to speak on this platform. I have chosen a topic which may not be of interest to everybody, because it is really about the formation of or knowledge formation in the global South. And what I'll basically be arguing is that, essentially the problems of knowledge formation in the global South really relate to knowledge production in the global North, because the educated in Southern countries read the textbooks and study the theories emanating from universities in the North. And Kathleen Gough in 1968 had argued in a widely read article in Monthly Review that anthropology was the child of imperialism. But if this was true, then I think to an even greater extent, economic theory is the child of imperialism. For the economic interests of countries in the global North have been very directly intertwined with the theories of political economy that have been developed in their universities. In fact, if we look at the 17th and 18th century, which was the period of mercantilism and the mercantilist writers on economics, they had been concerned primarily with external trade and its effects on their economies. For they were writing at a time when there was this was a period of violent external expansionism, and long-distance trade was growing fast. In fact, there was no separate discipline called economics at that time until well into the second half of the 19th century. It was moral philosophy and history that were subjects studied by those who wrote on political economy. And even when we get to Keynes, who was born in 1883, if I remember correctly, Keynes studied philosophy rather than economics as such. Now, if you look at Adam Smith, he was very well versed in both history and moral philosophy by the time he penned his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Karl Marx actually wrote his doctoral thesis on philosophy, on Democritus and Epicurus, before undertaking his magnum opus, the study of capitalism in Das Kapital. However, David Ricardo was an exception amongst the classical economists, because he was a stockbroker by profession. And he very modestly admitted to having studied neither philosophy or history. And I'm afraid this becomes very evident when one reads with a critical eye Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. That is, he had very good reason to be modest, I think, because despite his great cleverness in this area of formal logic, he could not avoid committing simple errors in applied logic, most importantly, in two respects. Firstly, Ricardo committed a verbal fallacy by using, without any explanation at all, a different definition of the rent of land. which delinked it completely from land ownership and the concentration of property. And these two factors, land ownership and the concentration of property, have been, on the contrary, emphasized by both Adam Smith and later by Karl Marx as essentially being responsible for giving rise to rent. But Ricardo, in fact, does not link his concept of rent, which is quite different from that of Adam Smith and Karl Marx's, to property concentration at all. But he does not spell out that his concept of rent was different. On the contrary, he criticized Adam Smith's concept. And secondly, Ricardo also committed a material fallacy in his theory of trade, which is the famous theory of comparative advantage, according to which if countries specialize according to their comparative cost advantage in particular products and then exchange those products through international trade, then they will all benefit. Now, the material fallacy that Ricardo produced here, and I will discuss it in a little more detail perhaps later on, is that he ignored the fact that a very large range of actually traded goods internationally could not be produced at all in cold temperate lands where today's advanced countries are located. And therefore, the cost of production was not even definable for these goods. If a good cannot be produced, it has no cost of production. I'll explain this later on. In fact, I've written very extensively on Ricardo's fallacy. Now, both of these fallacies that Ricardo committed served important apologetic functions, in my view. The first, that is using a different concept of rent from that used by Adam Smith and Ricardo, that diverted attention away from the reality of rent extraction under parasitic landlordism completely. And modern textbooks of economics have ignored both Adam Smith and Karl Marx on rent completely, and they have only picked up Ricardo's theory of rent. So there is a very big bias in the discussion of rent theory there, which is not generally recognized. Now, the second fallacy relating to the theory of comparative advantage was that by positing all trade based on specialization was beneficial for both parties engaging in trade and for all parties, in fact. Ricardo ignored the fact that precisely the opposite was true for colonial trade. In other words, colonial trade does not figure anywhere in his theory of comparative cost advantage. In fact, he posits it as a perfectly general theory. And there is where the fallacy lies, which I'll discuss later. Now, these logical errors in classical political economy are never mentioned in the existing modern literature. And in fact, textbooks writers have papered over the errors. Very probably because Ricardo's theory served so well, not only the interests of England as a rising industrial power, but they continue to serve today the present day interests of developed capitalist countries vis-a-vis the global South. That is, all economic students in the global South are still taught Ricardo's theory completely uncritically. Now, while as students we were given to understand, at least when I was a student, the general idea was that there were serious problems with neoclassical economics, but the major classical economists were considered to be virtually infallible and were to be treated with respect. While not contesting the fact that all serious scholars must be treated with respect, many decades of teaching and reflection has convinced me that as regards the problem of knowledge production, the formulation of factually and logically incorrect theories starts with English classical political economy. Now, this is a strong statement to make, but this is a statement that I would adhere to against arguments. And I think this is not surprising because political economy developed in England, as I mentioned, in the second half of the 18th century, during a period that its trade was increasing very fast, especially with its colonies of conquest, as distinct from its colonies of settlement. Colonies of settlement were countries like North America, where Europeans, the British to begin with, and other Europeans migrated in very large numbers to set up modern day USA, or other colonies of settlement were in South Africa, Australia, and so on. Whereas the colonies of conquest were those where the British exploited the local population without ever settling there. And they were mainly tropical colonies. The only exception as a colony of conquest was Ireland. That was not tropical, but it was one of the earliest colony of conquest of Britain, from which Britain extracted enormous amounts of surplus, as it did from its tropical colonies of conquest. Now, when Britain's trade was increasing very fast during the 18th century, particularly the second half of the 18th century, this was also the period of industrial revolution in Britain, which pioneered industrial revolution, which then spread to other continental countries, and then to North America and so on. Now, there was a very intimate connection between trade and industrial revolution. But this is this connection between international trade, particularly with colonies of conquest, and the rise of factory production, what is known as the Industrial Revolution, is something which continues to be ignored in the present-day literature on industrial revolution that comes out of northern universities. There were some people in England in the 18th century who did write with an honest regard to facts on the connection between colonial exploitation and domestic industrial transition. But subsequently, these writers have been completely ignored in the literature, and a narrative has been built up and assiduously promoted in which a purely internal dynamic is posited as the driver of the first industrial transition in England. That is, the historians of the Industrial Revolution in England deny that colonial trade, the fast-growing colonial trade, and they don't had anything to do with industrial revolution at all. And they, of course, completely ignore the reality of transfers of unrequited export surplus from the colonies, which financed the Industrial Revolution. Now, how does this show itself? This point that that really classical political economy was the child of imperialism. First of all, let me briefly mention Adam Smith's concept, or rather I would say the myth of the so-called invisible hand, which guides production and the division of labor. Now, actually, there was no invisible hand. The invisible hand could not be observed. It did not exist. But what we can observe are the very visible actions of highly aggressive and bellicose states that underpin the efforts of the rising capitalist classes in each of the maritime European states. Spain, Portugal, France, Netherlands, and Britain. These were the pioneers that in fact bitterly fought each other. They fought wars with each other to wrest control over lucrative trade routes, particularly to the trade routes to the colonies of conquest, to the tropical colonies. That is where the competition was extremely intense. Who would control the trade routes and who would control, because controlling colonies of conquest was not the same as controlling the trade with those colonies necessarily. Now, the argument we have put forward in our jointly authored book, A Theory of Imperialism, and then also explored in Capital and Imperialism, is something which has been completely ignored in the literature on economics. And that is the blatant reality, material reality, that cold-tempered European countries, and when they migrated to North America, the same holes of most of North America, Canada, and most of the US, had a very poor primary resource base at the start of their development process. And despite the substantial rise in yields of food crops in modern times, they still remain confined to a very severely limited range of crops, producible only in their few warm summer months. While the ground is frozen in winter, and can grow nothing. And no amount of technological change under capitalism can alter, as so far altered, climatic factors that make single cropping mandatory for today's advanced countries. Tropical countries, on the other hand, could produce, apart from the tropical hardwoods and tree crops, at least 2 field crops in the year. In the winter season, and I'm referring here to the regions north of the equator, which include India and China, our countries could produce all the crops producible in summer in cold temperate lands. All the crops that are producible in summer in cold temperate Europe and North America are producible here. Our markets now are full of the produce, and you don't have that fresh produce from local production in Europe and North America now. Their supermarkets are full, yes, but the fresh produce is all mandatorily imported from warmer lands. Remember that. Not a single item can be locally produced. In this month, we are in the last week of February now. The ground is still frozen. There are still blizzards to come. Okay, so every bit of fresh produce has to be imported today. They could not, fresh produce could not be imported in the past because they would perish. In the past, in colonial times, the only things that could be imported were the relatively less perishable items, that is food grains, edible oils, cane sugar, and so on. Okay. So there was a mandatory dependence that today's advanced countries had during their period of industrial transition on the superior productive capacity of tropical lands. And this is the basic fact, which is not only ignored in Ricardo's theory, but in every textbook of economics to this day. Now, you might imagine that this may be because people have not visited tropical countries. They have not seen, the enormous tropical biodiversity with their own eyes. But no, you can say that was true of Adam Smith, of David Ricardo, of Karl Marx. They had never gone outside Europe. Even Keynes had never traveled to a tropical country proper. The furthest east he had ever traveled was Egypt. And Egypt, with its pyramids in the desert, was not exactly a very big advertisement for tropical biodiversity for the European traveler. He never came to India, even though he had a 40-year-old connection with India. Because the first book that Keynes ever wrote was Indian Currency and Finance in 1913. The first job that Keynes ever held was at the India office in London. He joined it at the age of 23 and left at the age of 25. And, India played a role in his thinking. And he was a member of practically every committee on Indian currency and finance, as well as the Indian Fiscal Commission, which was set up from the 1920s onwards. In fact, from 1913 onwards, he was put on those commissions. So he had a very long connection with India, but he never visited India. So they had no direct experience at all of a tropical country. But today, that is not the case. I mean, within 15 hours, a North American economist or somebody from Europe can be at the other side of the world. They have every opportunity of observing with their own eyes how different tropical countries are in terms of their phenomenally superior primary resources. But, and this is the interesting thing, the hold of ideas is stronger than the hold of material reality which you see in front of your eyes. You may see material reality in front of your eyes, but you do not perceive it. Perceiving is different from seeing. You do not perceive it conceptually because your mind is already bound within the straitjacket of theories which have no role, which are given no role whatsoever to the fact that the primary driving force behind European external expansionism was that they wanted access to the superiority of tropical lands. Their own consumption basket was extremely poor, extremely limited. In fact, because they could only produce one crop of grain in the year, and right up till the mid-19th century, fossil fuels were not very important as a source of energy. The main source of energy still remained grain, which was fed to livestock, and it was horses and oxen which were used for transporting people and produce, for pulling barges full of coal from the mines. So there was dependence on grain, not only for food consumption by human populations, but it was the main source of energy. Fossil fuels have been used only for 2 centuries. And the interesting point is that as the fossil fuels get exhausted, moreover, as the advanced countries have not been able to successfully gain access to foreign sources of fossil fuels, because they lack fossil fuels themselves, they are reverting once more to the land. They are once more reverting to converting grain into ethanol, okay, which is a very interesting development with very important implications for global food security, which, if I have time, I will mention briefly towards the end of my talk. Now, in primary products, we include not only crops, we also include minerals, the fossil fuels I'm talking about. The latest estimates show that today's advanced capitalist countries, and by that I mean the United States, Canada, and the OECD countries plus Japan, okay? The advanced industrial countries have control within their own territorial boundaries over only 11% of the total known reserves of fossil fuels in the world. Only 11%. But they consume in excess of 40% of commercial energy. So this is just to give you an idea of how poorly they are endowed, even in terms of fuel resources, of energy resources. Now, you know, the whole question of oil politics, which affects West Asia and the advanced capitalists which have been behind the wars in West Asia, is so well known, has been so often discussed, that that is not something on which I want to spend any time at all. But one question which has not been discussed at all, and I'm assuring you that this is true, at all in the literature, is the one-sided dependence of advanced capitalist countries, not only during their period of industrialization in the past, but their continuing dependence on our lands, on the lands of the global South. Because this is something which is not taught to their own students ever. In fact, students are taught the fallacious theory of comparative advantage of Ricardo, nor is it taught to any of our own students. So that is a very major lacuna there. Going back to Adam Smith, you know, what kind of advice is Adam Smith giving the North Americans who became independent of British rule after their War of Independence at the end of the 18th century? I'll just give you a very quick quote. Actually, I don't really have time to cover all the very interesting topics under this broad rubric. Now, Adam Smith says this in The Wealth of Nations. It has been the principal cause of the rapid progress of our American colonies towards wealth and greatness that almost their whole capital has been employed in agriculture. They have no manufacturers. Those household and coarser manufacturers accepted, which are the work of the women and children in every private family. Were the Americans, either by combination or by any sort of violence, to stop the importation of European manufacturers? By European manufacturers, Smith actually here means British manufacturers, because the American colonists were not importing anything but British manufacturers. And I continue with the quote, and by thus giving a monopoly to such of their own countrymen as could manufacture the like goods, divert any considerable part of their capital into this employment, that is into manufacturing, they would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce. And they would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country towards wealth and greatness. So Adam Smith is telling the North Americans, your best interest is to stay agricultural producers. Don't try to replace what you import from us by way of manufacturers by trying to produce your own manufactured goods. Now, you can hardly find a clearer example of self-serving advice, than this advice from Adam Smith. Now, when you come to Ricardo, when you come to the mercantilist authors, it is the same thing. And very briefly on Ricardo's theory, which I have written very extensively on. And some of you may or may not have read what I've been writing for the last 16 years, because I keep mentioning Ricardo's fallacy all the time. Now, Ricardo's basic theory is that specialization, according to comparative cost advantage, is beneficial. And trade is beneficial for parties entering into trade, because each country will then have more of one good without having any less of the other. And he has this famous two-country, two-good model of England and Portugal. That is the example he gives in his book, where the two goods are cloth, woolen cloth actually, not cotton cloth, because when Ricardo was writing, England was still not able to produce fine cotton cloth. So woolen cloth on the one hand, and in Portugal, wine on the other. So cloth and wine are being produced by both Portugal and England. And he says that if we find that the relative cost of production of cloth is lower in England, and the relative cost of production of wine is lower in Portugal, then it would be to Portugal and England's benefit that Portugal should specialize completely in wine production and import its cloth from England, and England should specialize completely in cloth production and import its wine from Portugal. Now, when Ricardo is talking about wine, he's talking about grape wine. Now, there is a problem here, because grape wine could not be produced in England. The climate did not allow the production of grape wine, because the climate in England is, it requires a mean July isotherm of 19 degrees centigrade for grape vines to flourish and produce fruit. The continental river basins had that. Even some of the German river basins had that, but not England. It could not be produced in England. That is one problem, that Ricardo's own example was not correct. But even if he had chosen a correct example, his assumption that both countries can produce both goods is not true for a theory of trade. Because as I've already mentioned, the cold temperate lands could not produce any of the tropical goods that they actually consumed at any time of the year. And they could not produce in the winter months even the goods they could produce in the summer months. So they had a problem of seasonality, okay? So the assumption of both countries producing both goods is absolutely basic for you to be able to calculate, to define and calculate comparative cost. Because leave alone comparative cost, absolute cost did not exist. What is the cost of production of sugarcane in England? What is the cost of production of coffee in Germany? You could produce neither, then the output of sugarcane or coffee or a whole range of crops was zero in the past, is zero today, it will remain zero in the future in all cold temperate lands, okay? As simple as that. You cannot define cost of production. So the basic fallacy in Ricardo's theory is that he reached a conclusion based on an assumption which was factually untrue. Now, what economists have then gone on to do in modern times is to say, advise the advanced countries, the developing countries, China, India, developing countries in Africa, America, that as Ricardo has proved, free trade and specialization according to comparative cost will be beneficial for us as well as for you. So you should give up, for example, unnecessarily producing food grains. You buy your food grains from us. You should specialize in the commodities and goods in which you have lower relative cost of production, and you should export those goods to us. Now, that is based on a fallacious theory, because the real fact is that today, to this day, the advanced capitalist countries are not capable of producing a single unit of a tropical product. So they cannot even define comparative costs. So basically, it's a swindle. It's a kind of theoretical swindle which is being practiced. And it is being swallowed hook, line, and sinker. So that is what I mean by saying about the power of ideas, that if you're taught an idea when you're a young student, if you're taught a theory, and you're taught that, well, it is emanating from the so-called centers of advanced learning in the most advanced universities in the world. We are talking about global standards of academic work there. Then it is imprinted so deeply in your mind that even if you live in a country where you can see before your eyes that the Ricardian assumption is factually untrue, you will not perceive it. And in our own countries, for 2 centuries, teachers have continued to teach their students a fallacious theory, and those students, when they become teachers, pass on that fallacious theory. And the fallacy is a very simple logical fallacy, which logicians call the converse fallacy of accident. That is, when you draw an inference which is true of a very special condition. The special condition is both countries produce both goods. But then you improperly say that the inference is true, even in situations where the assumption is not satisfied. That is the converse fallacy of accident. And that is what is embodied in Ricardo's theory, and which every single, we don't need to have world-class economists coming from Stanford and Harvard and teaching our students this theory. It is there in their textbooks. It is being taught by people, by teachers in the global South. And that is the sad thing, that the theories, fallacious theories, which were developed in the period of imperialist expansion still continue to be taught today. Because what is the reality? The reality of imperialism was that there was a one-sided demand that today's advanced countries had during their period of industrial transition, and which they continue to have in a one-sided manner on our lands, because their lands are cold, single crop, incapable of producing the goods which are now an essential part of their consumption baskets. Okay, now think of the millions of tons of sugar and coffee and tea, etc., which were of raw cotton, which were imported into the cold temperate lands during their period of industrial transition. And you look at how the historians of industrialization talk about it. And for instance, what they try to do is to say that colonial trade was not important. The Industrial Revolution took place because of an internal dynamic which was in operation in the British economy and which was later generalized to other economies. And okay, trade was growing, there's no doubt about that. But supposing Britain had not imported those goods from its colonies, it could have produced those goods within Britain. There is actually an article by 2 economists who are located in the USA, I believe. This is Harley and McCloskey, who have written a widely read article, which is part of a collection of 3-volume set of textbooks, the economic history of Britain, in 3 volumes, which is taught to British students and is widely taught in other universities in the North to this day. So in this article, it is explicitly stated that Britain could have produced goods at a higher cost, perhaps, if it did not import. Now, this is mind-boggling. Can you imagine Kent in England producing coffee? Can you imagine Sussex producing sugarcane? I mean, this is amazing, completely delusional. And this is the kind of really intellectually infantile argument which is being fed to students in Britain and which is also being ingested by our own students in developing countries today. So you can see how important it is to have a critique of these theories. And by the way, economics, I don't think, is particularly unique in being full of fallacious theorization. Every discipline is full of this. It is just that we have not looked critically at the theories which we have, as it were, accepted uncritically in the past. And it is very, very essential to do that in order to rescue theories from the way that they are mired in fallacies at present. Another very important way in which fake theory and fake history is taught, I call it fake history, to our own students, and it is handed down from northern universities, is that the real history of mercantile discrimination, for example, against Indian textiles, which was so important. This discrimination was so important for the rise of the textile industry in Britain. This is completely obfuscated through what I call not acts of commission, but acts of omission. Now, the real history is this, that from, the East India Company traded in Indian textiles, fine cotton textiles to England right from the year 1600. Now, Britain could not produce fine cotton textiles because it could not grow raw cotton, nor did it have the manufacturing skills for spinning fine cotton. But these cottons became so popular with the local population that initially the elite, the ruling classes, and later on even the common people started demanding cotton, and the trade grew very fast. That is the import of cotton textiles from India. And the woolen industry in Britain took alarm because it said that this is competing with wool. Earlier, even in hot summer months, people were forced to wear light woolens, although wore a mixture of linen and cotton, which was called fustian, very coarse. So the woolen industry pressurized Parliament to pass an act in 1700, completely banning the importation of cotton textiles from England and Persia, as well as a range of other products like carpets and so on. But smuggling continued. So in 1721, the act was amended and a very huge fine was put both on individuals found to wear imported smuggled cotton goods from India and on merchants trading in these goods. And you had to be a very brave person in England to wear imported Indian cotton, because the people engaged in spinning and weaving wool would take direct action. They would actually attack people on the streets if they found them wearing imported Indian cotton. So this was a complete protection of the British market. And it went on for 74 years, 3/4 of a century. It took 3/4 of a century of discrimination against Indian textiles for the innovations in England to take place. And why did they take place? Because it was so profitable, potentially profitable, to find a substitute for the banned imports. People wanted these goods, but they were banned. Their use was banned. Their import was not, their use was banned. So anyone who could imitate these goods stood to make a fortune. So they tried, and finally, after 6 decades of attempting, they managed to innovate the Hargreaves spinning jenny. And later on, this was improved into various other devices, which could actually produce a cotton yarn fine enough and strong enough to compete with Indian yarn. So in 1774, Arkwright petitioned Parliament and said that, look, now cotton goods are being produced, and this is the basis of the rise of the factory system in England, the rise of the textile industry in England. And as Hobsbawm says, whoever says industrial revolution says cotton in England. Okay, so Arkwright petitioned Parliament and said, now it's being produced in England, please lift the ban on consumption of pure cotton. So the ban was lifted, but the entry of Indian and Persian cottons into England was still prohibited by raising tariffs. Tariffs were raised from something like 12-14% on some goods to 74-75% by 1813. So even when the first phase of the Industrial Revolution was over, the British economy was being protected against cheaper cost Indian textiles, and that was the basis of the rise of factory production. Now, you read the economists of the Industrial Revolution in England. Read historians of technical change in England. Read Eric Hobsbawm, Industry and Empire. Okay. Read David Land's The Unbound Prometheus. Read the textbooks I've already mentioned on the Industrial Revolution. Not a single article in that mentions the discrimination against Indian textiles, which lasted for almost 150 years. 74 years of direct ban, followed by another 70 years or so of tariffs, and the last tariffs only went in 1846. So now nearly 150 years is a very long period. We are not talking here about Eurocentrism. we are talking about the competent and honest writing of economic history, where you cannot suppress facts. And the fact of the matter is that these facts have been suppressed in the writings I have mentioned. And very sadly, even the eminent Marxist economic historian, Christopher Hill, who has this very important book, From Reformation to Industrial Revolution. Now he's talking explicitly of mercantilist theories, which was practiced by England against Ireland, which were practiced by England against Americans. The Americans were not permitted, as long as they were colonized, to produce manufactured goods. Even hats and pins and so on had to be imported from England. The Irish were prevented from producing cotton textiles. They could produce linen, but that is it. They were forbidden to produce cotton textiles. So he mentions all that. But there is not a word in Christopher Hill's Reformation to Industrial Revolution on the nearly 150 years of discrimination against Indian textiles. Why not? Now, I'm not saying that it was very conscious. I'm saying that the entire thrust of theorizing has been in a direction where people simply didn't talk about it, nor did they give any references to the authors who did talk about it at great length. These were the continental writers. Friedrich List, in his book, talked extensively on the discrimination that England practiced against India historically through its ban and then high tariffs. Then, and Ramesh Chandra Dutt quotes List very extensively. And then Paul Mantoux has the best book on the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, where again, he discusses what I've been talking about. In fact, most of my data have been taken from Paul Mantoux's book. He was a Frenchman. And later on, the person who talks extensively about mercantilist discrimination is Paul Baran. Now, Paul Baran was a first-generation European migrant to the United States. So the Europeans talk about it, but these Europeans are not even referred to by the historians of the Industrial Revolution that I've mentioned. And some of them are not English either, or they're people from England who have migrated to US universities. For example, I don't really know whether Donald McCloskey is a migrant from an English university or from an American, but as I've said, Harley and McCloskey put forward this absurd proposition that Britain could have actually produced itself if it did not import from its colonies of conquest. So there is a very big problem. There's a problem not only for us in the global south, there's a problem for students in the global north, because what they're being taught is not actually factually correct. Okay. And in the interests of truth, we need to correct these misconceptions. Now, what the British actually did in its colonies of conquest, again, is something which is completely ignored in the writing of economic history of Britain. And in fact, also in present day writing of the economic history of India, because taking their cue from their foreign mentors, unfortunately, many Indian writers on economic history tend to ignore or even positively run down our great pioneers, that is Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt. Some of them say, oh, you know, their estimates of the drain were old and old-fashioned and nobody takes them seriously. You know, it's shocking that economics historians from our own country actually, instead of celebrating and looking seriously at what Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt have achieved, are so influenced by the biased theories emanating from northern universities that they are actually critical of our own patriots. Now, what the British actually did in India was very different from what the Belgians did in the Congo, or what, for example, the Germans did in Namibia. Now, under King Leopold in Belgium, in the Congo, there was a reign of terror which was let loose from 1884 to the First World War, because natural rubber was collected in the Congo by actually, enslaving local men and taking their family as hostages, they had to collect natural rubber from the forest, because at that time, the automobile industry in Europe was just taking off. So the big demand for rubber, for tires and so on. Their families were held hostages, and the right hand of the men who refused to cooperate, the local inhabitants of Congo, their right hands were cut off, and they were put up on display in order to discipline remaining workers. That, look, this is what is going to happen to you if you don't actually provide free labor. Similarly, atrocities were committed by the Germans in Namibia. Germany, as a late industrializer, acquired colonies very late, from, again, like Belgium, from the 1880s. And in Namibia, it actually set up camps which were like concentration camps, which were widely regarded as being a model for later Nazi concentration camps in Germany. And if a tribe refused to cooperate, they practiced genocide. They actually physically eliminated that tribe, because the largest such camp was a death camp. So all this is now coming out, about the history of colonialism. Now, the British were very clever. Apart from the Great Bengal Famine of 1769-70, in which such oppression was exercised on the Bengal peasantry immediately after acquiring the Diwani of Bengal, that is the right of revenue collection in Bengal from the Mughal emperor in 1765, the East India Company seemed to have gone mad with avarice, because they were now collecting directly revenue. And for them, the revenue was the same as collecting produce, because they could use the revenue for purchasing the produce. So it was the same as getting produce free. They trebled the land revenue collections in Bengal over a period of 5 years. Earlier, Nawab was already collecting sufficient revenue. Can you imagine what happens if you treble the revenue collection? You're taking away the seed corn from the peasantry. You're taking away their own means of subsistence. So you had a massive famine by 1770, in which the officials of the company itself who toured the province, they set up a commission to inquire. They toured the province. They said about 10 million people had died, and large areas were completely depopulated. That is 10 million out of an estimated population of 30 million. So this was actually also a genocide. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the Cambridge Economic History of India, there is no mention of the Great Bengal Famine of 1769-70. There is no mention by not just the historians from foreign universities, who are talking about Eastern India, or any mention by David Morris, who's writing about the textile industry. There is no mention by the Indian economic historians also, because they're so completely hegemonized by whatever they have read and acquired from books written in the global north. But the real mechanism that the British used was much more clever after this. There was no direct atrocities committed in the way that you had in the Congo, or in the way that you had, or no directly observable genocide in the way that you had in Namibia. What they did was far more clever, as befitted the home of political economy. They actually followed a financial and economic modes of exploitation of the entire population, entire working population. They were very kind towards the property classes. They made sure that the property classes were not affected. They actually created a new class of zamindars in Bengal, with new property rights. And the traders and merchants benefited under their rule. But what they did was to collect taxes from the laboring poor, from the peasantry, but also in the form of indirect taxes from workers. And the tax collection was enormous. They kept up that high level of tax collection, much higher than the previous Muslim rulers had collected. And they used part of their taxes, as you know, for expanding their rule to the rest of India, rest of British India. But they used a quarter to 1/3 of the taxes they collected for so-called purchasing goods from the very same artisans and peasants from whom they had collected the taxes in the first place. So they were not actually paying them. It appeared to the peasants and artisans that they were getting money for the goods that they sold, in the same way as they got money from the local merchant. But that money was coming out of their own taxes, which they did not know. So effectively, in economic terms, what was happening is that taxes collected in cash were simply being converted into the form of kind. And the British got all their export goods completely free. Now, they exported these goods abroad far in excess of what they required in England itself as food or raw materials. They re-exported a very large part of their products to other European countries where there was a very eager demand for tropical goods, but which did not have colonies themselves. Okay, so all the gold, apart from using these goods for their own industrialization and their own consumption as wage goods, they also acquired gold and sterling from re-exporting these goods, and all of it went into the British treasury. So the gold and sterling that they acquired by getting goods free, by using taxes to finance the import of these goods, was so large that it is quite mind-boggling. I've attempted an underestimate, it's an underestimate of what it amounted to over the nearly 180 years that the British ruled India. But this is a mode of exploitation which has not been discussed fully in the literature, because our modern economic historians, with a few honorable exceptions, such as Professor Omyo Bakchi, have completely ignored the insights which were originally provided by Dadabhai Naoroji and by Ramesh Dutt, those great pioneers who quite correctly pointed out that what Britain was doing to India was to obtain its export surplus earnings without any quid pro quo, without paying for it. They were absolutely right in that. But we can work it out in very precise scientific terms using a simple Keynesian framework today, which was, of course, not available to the pioneers at that time. Now, what is the connection with poverty? Just two sentences, because I've really taken too long already. I think I have already spoken for like 50 minutes, but I'll just take 3 or 4 minutes more and then wind up. Because this is, a very huge area. It's very difficult to cover even a fraction of it in the time that I have. What is the connection of this with poverty? Well, within a simple Keynesian framework, if you are collecting taxes far in excess of what you're actually spending within the country under normal heads, it means operating surplus budgets, okay? And the surplus budgets were huge. At least 1/3, and in many years up to 40% of the total tax revenue collections were not being spent within India, but were being simply converted to goods which were obtained free. So if people who know anything about Keynesian macroeconomic theory will know that surplus budgets of this magnitude will mean a very severe compression of employment and incomes in the countries on which such surplus budgets are being imposed. Okay. Now, even the World Bank and the IMF do not ask countries to operate zero budgets today. Okay. They simply say, cut your budget deficit. If you have surplus budgets, it means you're actually pressing down the local people into increasing unemployment, into increasing loss of income, into increasing poverty. And that is precisely what was happening in British India for a long 180 years. Poverty is the creation of colonial exploitation, of imperialist exploitation. And that is, poverty is a legacy which we inherited at independence. Most people do not realize that our country had a lower level of mass consumption of the basic food grains, of rice and wheat. The food grains are rice, wheat, coarse grains, okay, plus pulses. It had a lower level at independence of basic consumption than any other developing country had, any other large developing country. They don't know it because they don't look at the international data, but it is true. We started with an immensely unfavorable legacy. Now, 40 years of policies to raise our per capita consumption levels succeeded to some extent, but by the early 1990s, these policies were reversed, and by the early 1990s, we had still not got back to the level we had around 1900. We were still somewhat short in terms of basic grain availability per capita of the level we had in 1990. And since the early 1990s, our availability per capita has been going down. It has been going down steeply until, and I've written very extensively on that, and if you look at the international data, then the latest data which we have is probably 2020. That shows, and this has been, the data have been showing this from the Food and Agriculture Organization. It has been showing this right from the late 1990s, that our availability has been, our food consumption has been going down. That is, the basic food consumption of grain has been going down. And by 2020, 2019, 2020, I've been looking at the latest data, we are still ranking at the bottom. We rank below the least developed countries. We rank below the average for Africa. We, of course, rank far below China. China is about the world average. So, you know, the recent debate over the World Hunger Index showing us at the bottom would simply is really, I mean, our economists have simply not looked at the data which have been available for the last 30 years. They have been deluding themselves, just as the British economic historians delude themselves that they could have produced tropical goods, that Britain could have produced tropical goods. Our economists have been deluding themselves. We are a nation with a high GDP rate of growth, and poverty has been declining. In fact, poverty has not been declining. Poverty has been rising, not only in our country, but throughout the global south. Because throughout the global south, the neoliberal economic policies, which have reversed Nehruvian type policies, have been followed for the last 30 years. Now, if there are questions and so on, I can expand a little bit on what the neoliberal economic policies are, because I think I've used up all my speaking time. So let me stop there, and I can talk, if people are interested, on what the real poverty proportions are compared to what the official estimates are for India. So thank you very much for whoever is listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. I think that was a very wonderful recap and eye-opening take on what we as students of economics have missed in our studies across bachelor's and master's. It was a very eye-opening lecture. It made, I think, many of us ponder to go back to the roots of as to why we were taught what we taught. So I'm now opening up the floor for questions, and if anybody has a question, may they please raise their hand, and can you type the question, because ma'am has requested us that she would like one of the organizers to relay the questions rather than the participants themselves unmuting themselves. So if that's okay, could you please type down the questions? Meanwhile, I think Dhondial, if I'm pronouncing your name right, has a question. And for the first question, I would like you to unmute yourself and ask. The remaining people can please type down the questions. Dhondial, you can go first if you would like to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over the right of asking the first question to Satvik. Dhondial, you have 2 seconds to unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay. So Satvik, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask, because
I think I have restricted the participants from asking questions. So Shruti, you would like to ask? I'm asking you to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself?
Satvik,
yes,
yeah,
please.
Hi. Thank you so much for the lecture, ma'am. I don't have a question. I would rather ma'am continue if it's possible and there are no questions with her talk. I was saying that.
Okay. So I have a question, if I may. I was wondering, I mean, throughout the global south, also in India, different kind of property rights was in practice, especially with on land as a property, different land use. So how do you think this enlightened philosopher imposed idea of property rights as exclusion from others has affected the way land is used in global south, or for example in India?
No, I didn't get the second half of the question. Could you repeat it?
How do you think that this exclusion-based property rights based on which European scholars wrote economics has impacted societies in India then? Because earlier our understanding of property rights was perhaps different.
Okay, yeah. So would you like me to answer that straight away? Because there's no other question at the moment.
You can take over this question, and then we would like you to continue on the neoclassical and neoliberalism aspect of your discussion.
Okay. So yeah, you're quite right that the British instituted a new set of property rights in India, which was basically the all pre-capitalist economic systems, class systems, that is, had a hierarchy of customary rights to property already. For example, if you look at Mughal India, there was a hierarchy of customary rights. The peasants had a certain right of occupation of the soil. There was no eviction of peasants if they failed to pay rent, and there was very often remission of rent payment or revenue payment in the case of the Mughal Empire if the harvest failed. So a customary right of occupation was recognized. And there was a right of collection of surplus from the peasantry in the form of revenue, with various layers of intermediaries from the topmost jagirdars down in this process, developing over time, of course, as Professor Irfan Habib and others have brilliantly pointed out. But this was a customary structure of land rights. Now, what the British did was that they tried to, as it were, impose the notion of ownership in the modern sense of land being mortgageable, alienable, transferable, and so on this kind of a system. And of course, Karl Marx called the zamindari system in Bengal, which the British instituted, a caricature of British landlordism. And then, by the way, why was there a permanent settlement in Bengal at all? Because this links up with what I said earlier about the enormous devastation and depopulation caused by the 1769-70 Great Bengal famine. Because there was such large depopulation that when Cornwallis, after losing the Battle of Independence in America, came to Bengal and looked at the whole land settlement question, he saw that it was not possible to get the depopulation reversed and to get the wastelands, land which had reverted to jungle, cultivated again, unless the revenue was fixed. If you were going to raise the revenue, which was already very high in future, then the depopulation would continue. So that is why you had a permanent settlement in Bengal and in parts of South India, in Madras, coastal areas, but nowhere else, because once the British got control over Bengal and its revenues, and the revenues were not just from the land, which was permanently fixed, but the revenues were also from opium cultivation. The revenues were from other indirect opium monopoly. Bengal, remember, at that time was not today's Bengal alone, but Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and today's Bangladesh, all combined, right? And you had other revenues. So they used part of the Bengal revenues to expand their control elsewhere. So the zamindars were given a right, legal rights of actually, evicting tenants if they did not pay the rent, which was unheard of in the pre-capitalist system. Now, in Rayatwari areas, they did not give the local rent collectors under the Mughal system, the iqtidars and the jagirdars, this kind of right, because they took over that right themselves, the British. They told the former iqtidars and jagirdars, because actually under the Rayatwari system, it was not the actual peasants that they contracted with. The so-called Rayatwari systems and the Mehalwari systems, that the Mehalwari system in North India and later Rayatwari system in South India, to a very large extent, was a contract between the colonial government and people who were already people at the, as it were, the top, towards the top of the land rights pyramid in rural areas. People who are not themselves people who directly cultivated the land, who put in manual labor, but who in turn extracted surplus from either their tenants or from employing customary long-term laborers. So there the British instituted a system where they said, look, you are in occupation of your your revenue collecting rights from the peasantry, as long as you pay this much to us, and every 25 to 30 years, we will raise that revenue. We will raise that demand, which is what they did. In fact, they kept raising the demand. And there is, of course, a very interesting study by Eric Stokes, which traces the roots of the Great Rebellion of 1857 to 59. The fact that, the landed proprietors in North India, in today's Uttar Pradesh, participated in that rebellion. Some of them led that rebellion, was because they stood, they were getting their land taken over, their customary land rights taken over by the colonial state for non-payment of the revenue in time. Okay, I don't know how many of you have read Eric Stokes on this. A very interesting reason that he gives for why the zamindars in Bengal under the permanent settlement supported the British during the Great Rebellion, but actually what is today's Uttar Pradesh, the Uttar Pradesh talukdars and zamindars fought against the British, and some led the uprising against the British in many cases. So I don't know whether that answers your question. It's a very huge area again. I could go on for 1 hour talking about it.
No,
okay.
Thank you. Anisha.
Sorry. So at the request of all our participants, may you would like to elaborate on the neoliberalism part that you were mentioning earlier? Maybe you can take a couple of maybe 7 to 10 minutes to just elaborate on that aspect, on how these policies have increased poverty, inequality in the global south, and then we can bring this session to a close.
Okay, and let me start with India and then perhaps talk about the global south also, because again, when India became independent, it was in the aftermath of a massive famine in Bengal. The British rule in India started with the famine in Bengal, massive famine, which I talked about. British rule in India ended with another massive famine, the 1943-44 Great Bengal famine, in which an estimated 3 million people died, of whom I estimate that at least 1 million were children below the age of 14 years, because that is what the age structure of the population was, according to the census. So this is not generally mentioned, that about 1/3 of the people who died were really children, defined as those of 14 years and less. So, and this famine again was a direct result of British colonial policy, in particular Keynes's policy of passing the burden of financing the war against Japan onto the Indian revenues. And the way this was done was actually to print money to such an enormous extent. This is what Keynes called the profit inflation, that there was a deliberate inflation, a very rapid inflation, which meant that the consumption level of the mass of the poor who were dependent on the market for purchasing food fell drastically within a period of about 18 months. And that is what resulted in 3 million people dying of starvation. Now, I have discussed this in a paper, I don't know if any of you have read it, originally published in October 2018 as a special article in Economic and Political Weekly. And it is also a chapter, an edited version of that, because that was a very strongly worded paper. And my co-author thought it had to be toned down a bit. So it has also been slightly, sanitized and then published as a chapter in our joint book, Capital and Imperialism. In particular, the parts on which I talk about racism and so on, that has been cut out. So, but I think whatever I said there was, he didn't disagree. Let me not give a wrong impression. My husband Prabhat didn't disagree with what I said, but he just said that, keep it at a level where people are not too shocked, as it were, by your language. All right. So remember that we inherited at independence a situation which was extremely dire. And this is a situation which was very clearly visible to the tall leaders we had then. It was visible to the communist leaders, it was visible to Pandit Nehru and to P.C. Mahalanobis, and they knew that it was absolutely necessary to de-link from the global market. because it was really exposure to the global market that determined our cropping pattern, and the fact that what our peasants had to produce was really for advanced countries' needs and not for their own needs, that their own consumption was made to reduce drastically through methods of reducing their own purchasing power. This was true for the entire period of colonial rule, but there was a special additional policy of rapid inflation during the war, which reduced the consumption level, again, very drastically, over and above the long-term reduction that we know all about, all right? So please remember, we were in an exceptional situation. So our leaders at that time said, look, we have to delink from the global market. So they put in place a system of cordoning off small production from the destabilizing effect of global demand by putting in place quantitative restrictions on exports and imports and systems of tariffs. That is, for example, even if the global price of food grains was high, we would not export food grains to the global market as long as the domestic demand was not satisfied. Domestic market demand was not satisfied. If you did not have this restriction, food grains would flow out, okay? Or even if the global demand for raw cotton was very high and the price went very high, there were restrictions on the export of raw cotton as long as the requirements of our handloom weavers, our powerloom weavers, and our mills for producing for the domestic market were not satisfied. In other words, there was a privilege given to satisfying domestic needs, which had been pushed down to rock bottom during this whole period of colonial rule, and particularly additionally during the war period. Now, from this Nehruvian system, and also there was an emphasis on building up our own food security by putting in a lot of investment in agriculture. At that time, we criticized it, saying that, look, this is not enough, there should be more, and so on. Now, that is different. But the fact of the matter is that a great deal of investment did go into irrigation investment. It went into land reclamation projects. It went into extension services. It went into research into high-yielding crop varieties. A huge attack was mounted on all this from the advanced country universities, and those who were taught there and internalized that argument started mounting an attack on Nehruvian dirigist policies. Dirigism is state direction. Dirigism is a French word meaning that the state is directing where the investment is going. Where is it going to for the good of your own population or just to satisfy foreign demand? Where is the output going? Is it going to satisfy the demand of the poor in your own country, or is it going out to fill supermarket shelves? You see, that is dirigism. So an enormous attack on this was mounted from the middle 1980s, I would say, from the northern universities, including by economists who had their training there, who we call the very neoliberal economists. So this is neoliberalism, and they mounted an attack firstly on state investment. This was all part of the World Bank and IMF theory that the government should withdraw and leave investment to the private sector. So part of this is cutting back on government spending, on investment, and effectively also on the social sectors. So that is one pillar of neoliberalism. And that pillar is replicating what was happening in the colonial period, because the colonial government was not really interested in investing in irrigation and in improving the lot of the ordinary people. It invested only in Punjab, next to UP, because there it could grow irrigated crops for export, and it took all the export earnings for itself. So that was the argument under which irrigation was permitted. But otherwise, it was not really investing very much, okay? So the new neoliberal policies, which are associated with the World Bank, IMF, with the advanced country economists mounting an attack on a country like India for following Nehruvian policies, that the one main pillar of that is government should not invest, leave it to the private sector. And therefore, government should cut back on public spending. the fiscal deficit, they even had a number, the fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of GDP, okay? And that is what is embodied in the FRBN Act, which unfortunately was passed, was made into law, not by the NDA government, but by the Congress-led government. What is it called? UPA government in 2004. Because by then, the Congress had changed, the economic leadership of the Congress has changed completely. It had done a 180-degree turn from Nehruvian policies to anti-Nehruvian policies, you can say. So this was one pillar. Implement the World Bank directive on cutting back on government spending. And that has an immediate impact on lowering the rate of growth in agriculture, in lowering the prospects of food security being improved. And that is the period, the early 90s, from which you get a decline in per capita food availability for domestic consumption. Immediate impact. The second main pillar was opening up to global trade, again pushed incessantly by the advanced countries, by the World Bank and IMF. And of course, this is part of what I call the economic recolonization of India, and indeed of all developing countries, because the same policies were being advised to the African countries, to the Latin American countries, and so on. India, in fact, had a longer period under Nehruvian dirigism, about 40 years. Some of the African countries became independent only in the 1960s. And they had hardly a 10-year period or 15-year period of, trying to protect themselves from the global market before the loan conditionalities from the IMF came in, saying that you have a balance of payments problem, you've taken a loan, you have to open up, you have to do this and do that. Okay, so free trade is the other element. And it ties back to Ricardo and free trade, you see. And it is interesting that in conferences which I attended a long time ago, 20 years ago now, or 15 to 20 years ago in Europe, which was, I don't know why I was invited to these conferences, because I was supposed to be the token left-winger in a right-wing, as it were, conclave, you see, so that they could say that they're not completely biased against alternative views. But anyway, I went to one such thing. And Ricardo was being quoted in the year 2005 in Berlin, in a huge conference, which was being attended by the agriculture ministers of developing countries. It was being attended by the WTO. By then, the WTO, of course, had been in operation for 10 years. The person directing the WTO, whatever the formal name is concerned, by United Nations, people from the UNCTAD and so on, all big bureaucrats from the international institutions. And they were all telling the developing countries that agriculture ministers, you have to open up. Because Ricardo has shown, 200 years after Ricardo wrote his fallacious theory, his theory was still being propagated, telling us that you have to remove your protection to your farmers. You have to remove your protection to your small producers, because you're going to get, they even gave us numbers, so many $1 billion of additional benefit if you have free trade. So that is why it is a recolonization. And not a single one of them paused to think for a moment, why are we doing this? Why are we pressurizing? Why are the developing countries not interested in importing from us? It is because the developing countries have all the primary products they want. I don't think any of you are dying to eat Brussels sprouts, or even dying to have whatever it's called, waffles with maple syrup. We have enough variety of food in our own countries. But it is the developed countries which are desperate, because the major part of their consumption basket would simply disappear. They would not get their coffee and tea and the beverages. They would not get fresh fruit or vegetables in winter. They would not get raw cotton. They would not get even cotton clothing to wear, to the extent that they produce in their own countries. Now, of course, there's also a relocation of manufacturing to a number of third world countries, so textile manufacturing in particular. So this is the gist of neoliberalism. And essentially, it is recapitulating the policies of the colonial period in the new situation where advanced countries no longer have direct political control, but they nevertheless exercise pressure. And a very important part of the pressure they exercise, because they do not have direct political control, is through ideology, is through feeding you with fallacious theories and telling you that you're going to benefit from doing A, B, and C, when actually your own populations are going to lose out and lose out very badly from following these particular policies. Okay, so the role of theory and of ideology has become much more important today than it ever was. Because in the past, they didn't need it. They directly controlled your budget. They directly controlled your foreign exchange earnings. Now they don't. So they have to persuade the governments in our countries to do their work for them. And sadly, the government economists all fall into the trap. And they all say that, well, if the advanced country centers of learning and, are advocating this, then these are the policies we must follow. It leads to a kind of intellectual servility, a complete hegemonization combined with total intellectual servility, where we seem to have lost the ability to think independently. Okay. And by the way, the Nobel Prize is one element of this ideological onslaught, because Nobel as a scientist did not have a Nobel Prize in economics. It was initiated much later. And there's a very interesting article by a scholar whose name I now forget, who points out that the idea of instituting a Nobel in economics was very clearly ideological, because at that time, left-wing ideas and anti-imperialist ideas were rampant. So to counter that, they needed to boost, as it were, mainstream economic theory, which tells you that you should cut back on public investment, you should open up your country to global trade. And the Nobel only goes to people who are in some way or the other. Occasionally, you may have a genuine candidate. For example, I would say that Professor Amartya Sen's work on welfare economics was certainly deserving, independently of any ideological considerations of a Nobel. But most Nobel Prizes in economics today, you will see, come on the basis of work which really is upholding a mainstream ideological viewpoint. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. I understand that you have to go now, but thank you very much for your time, and I hope we will consider our invitation in future, maybe in some in-person conference where we can invite you for a keynote. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, sure. I had no time to talk about the fallacy underlying poverty estimation, because I'm talking about poverty rising when all governments and the World Bank is saying poverty has declined. So on what basis am I saying it? On the basis of a fallacy in the way they estimate poverty, right? But I had no time to discuss that fallacy at all. So yeah, sure. I can.
We will invite you again.
Later.
We will invite you again.
Thank you very much for talking.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you will join us for the next session. Thank you, Professor Patnaik. Thank you.
Thank you.